Hello, and welcome to Catholicism in the Car. My name is Parker Zerba. Alrighty, everybody. I'm going to call this episode Catholicism in the Car with Dogs, or Talking About Dogs, because I'm not going to resume with the episode on hope yet. We'll do that in the next episode or two. But I am driving with both my dogs in the back seat, and so you might hear them whining or something. We'll see. But I thought it would be fitting to do an episode on animals, and particularly on those animals that are close to us, like the most the highest order animals, I guess you could say. Or highest order beasts, because human beings are technically animals. So you could distinguish the human animals and the bestial animals, I guess. But I think it's kind of a fun topic. Shoot, I need to be in the other lane. I just totally did something weird. I pulled into the left turn lane, and I had to get out of it into the first one, or the straight one, going straight. And I definitely confused me. I'm sorry. Okay, so you can distinguish between human animals and bestial animals, right? And so what is the nature of an animal? We've talked a lot about what the nature of a human being is. That they're a rational, but yet corporeal or bodily type of being. That's kind of what human beings are. But what distinguishes human beings from the animals is that human beings are particularly rational. Talked about this, I think one of the best examples of rationality is that human beings have the potential, not that they always can utilize this potential or do utilize this potential, but human beings have the potential, at least, to think purely abstractly, as much as possible. So meaning that we don't, there are certain things that we can think about that we don't necessarily need images of to think about. Those are very few things. And I've said that I think one of the most important of those, an example of those things would be the example of true infinity. It's something which cannot be really even imagined, but yet we know about it. I can't formulate an imagination of infinity. In philosophy, a lot of times they'll call it a phantasm. So a phantasm is something in the imagination where, like, if I imagine a unicorn is a phantasm because it's something that I'm imagining. Right, and it's usually amalgamation of physical things in the world, things that I've seen before. It's like amalgamation of that, even if it doesn't exist in the real world, or it's something that does exist in the real world, but it's a hypothetical notion of that thing. Like I'm thinking about a hypothetical cougar in my mind right now, or a leopard or something. So anyway, you can probably hear my dogs whining. They do pretty good in the car. They get a little stressed out sometimes. So that's what human nature is. And animals, I think it would be safe to argue that animals have at least the potentiality for some animals have the potentiality to have phantasms, have imagination, right? I mean, for example, you can think of a dog having dreams or something. That happens quite frequently, actually, in the grand scheme of things. And a dream, if a dog is dreaming that he's chasing a ball, or, he's barking in his sleep, things like that, he's most likely, as far as we can tell, right, having some sort of an imagination or a phantasm of something that exists in the real world, and he's kind of putting those things together in his head, and it's turning into a dream, right? So I think higher order animals definitely have the ability for these sorts of phantasms or imagination. But again, what distinguishes them from human beings is they wouldn't have the ability to think purely abstractly and then also to think rationally. Like an animal can't do calculus, for example. They don't even have the potential to learn calculus. Now, some might argue that's because they don't have language and we're not able to communicate with them. Maybe if we could communicate with them, they could learn these things. But if you can teach, I don't know, if you can, you don't necessarily need spoken language to communicate with someone, right? You can teach a baby sign language. You can teach certain apes sign language up to a limited extent. Oh wow! Sorry, guy almost cut me off. So yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is animals have the potential for imagination, but they don't have the potential to do things like calculus, much more abstract sorts of thinking. And that's another thing that would differentiate them. Now, even if it could be proven, I think that an animal could do calculus, somehow we could teach it calculus, right? Maybe an ape or something. I think still you could say that, well, maybe calculus isn't the best example. Calculus does involve the idea of infinity, but it involves a mathematical infinity instead of a philosophical infinity. You could say a mathematical infinity would be like an infinite line going in all directions, or the infinity of numbers, right? So it's not actually pure infinity in the sense that mathematical infinity it deals with an infinite number of things, whereas philosophical infinity, I would argue, and maybe these aren't the correct academically philosophical terms here, but I'll define them for you so that you can think along with me. Philosophical infinity, I would argue, would be more like one infinite. It wouldn't even be a thing at that point. Like the fact that we can even imagine something that is so far beyond our own comprehension that we can't even consider it as being a thing. Like the fact that I can describe this to you right now, something like that. So, this could be almost like the argument of Anselm for his ontological argument, right? Like he says, something that is greater than what can even be conceived. Like, think about something even greater than you can think about. And that's, you're approaching this idea of philosophical infinity, which is what most classical theists would consider God. So the fact that human beings can even approach that sort of a thought. Now, we can't grasp it, obviously, but the fact that we can even approach that sort of thought, I think, is at least a clear pinpoint where that would distinguish us from the animals. Because I think a lot of other sort of thoughts that we would consider abstract are really more just a combination of different things that we view in the physical world. Like when I think about numbers, I think about numbers as they're drawn on a chalkboard or something like that. When I think about mathematics, I think about the thing that's written on the chalkboard as it's somehow been depicted to me, right? To do mathematics, you have to have some sort of depictions, even if it's just in your head, right? So, dogs are barking at each other. They're getting a little antsy back there. So yeah, I think even if one could prove that animals could somehow do a sort of mathematical type of abstraction, or the abstraction of what I would consider an even lower type of abstraction, like a unicorn or something, I think that's still, you could still create a barrier there between man and the animals and the beasts, in that man can think in that absolutely purely abstract way. He at least has the ability to reach towards it, right? Even if he can't fully grasp it. Like an animal can't do that. They can't do that sort of high sort of philosophy. I think definitely one can argue that an animal doesn't have the ability to do that. So I don't know. I've been thinking about these things a lot lately. I think about a lot of stuff, obviously, from the fact that I make all these episodes on this podcast. But yeah, it's an interesting question, because in Christian history, at least for a lot of the Middle Ages, people kind of assumed that animals were just these brutes, and many of them obviously are. But it's interesting when you have domesticated animals. What's going on there? Are they able to have higher order thinking than our other types of animals? Okay. Dang it, I just received a phone call, so I lost track of... I lost my train of thought. Anyway, we were talking about the difference between animals and humans and all that kind of stuff. I think I pretty much wrapped that up. I was probably just rambling at this point. So, I think that there are some really good sorts of distinctions that one can make. And I think that one can argue even against the hypotheticals of, say, animal rights people that there is still a very clear difference between human beings and animals, even if you go into the hypothetical. I don't think one can argue that even hypothetically an animal, a bestial animal, could have that sort of philosophically abstract kind of thinking in that way. Unless, of course, somehow God gives them an infused knowledge for a moment. You could think of the donkey that talked to, what was it, Balaam or Balak? I always get them mixed up. In the Old Testament, what was that? The book of Judges, I think? When the donkey turns around and starts rebuking Balaam or Balak, whichever one it was, it says, like, stop whipping me, you're hurting me, basically. And I think that actually brings us to a really interesting topic. Again, a little mad back there. It's hot, and they're hot, probably a little cranky. That brings us to an interesting question. God can maybe work these miracles through an animal where they allow them some sort of rationality for a minute, a moment in time, as basically as a miracle. And certainly that's possible if you take into the account that God is omnipotent and omniscient and all these sorts of things. But yeah, that's leading me towards now, maybe a subtopic within this discussion, and that would be the topic of, like, what rights do animals have? Because every creature, I think, deserves some sort of respect in a way. I would say every creature deserves some sort of respect. It's just what level of respect do you give it? I would say even, inanimate or in non-sentient, non-moving objects, or even like plant life, deserves a certain amount of respect. That's why I do think it would be considered quite immoral for someone to haphazardly chop down a forest without replanting it. Especially if, it would especially be immoral if they're just chopping it down and then not using the wood. They're just chopping it down for no good reason at all, just to be basically malicious to the environment. That would certainly be a sin against creation. Because God has created the world and He called it good. Now, with the original sin, man and the whole world was affected by original sin, and there are then consequences of original sin. And we could go down a rabbit hole on that topic. But it is kind of interesting, because the covenant with Noah, actually, God gives Noah and those who were on the ark with him, he gives them permission then to eat the animals, to not just eat plants. So Scripture is actually quite clear that prior to Noah, prior to the Noahic covenant with Noah, that human beings were actually vegetarian, which is quite fascinating. And I mean, it has been clear that that part of the Noahic covenant has not been restored, because in the book of Acts, God shows, what was it? Was it St. Peter or St. Paul? I can't remember. He shows them a vision and says, hey, you're able to eat all these different types of animals now that were restricted even still with the Mosaic covenant, the covenant with Moses. Jews aren't allowed to eat pork, certain types of seafood, right, and a number of other things. And in the book of Acts, Christians were freed from that restriction of the covenant. Yeah, oh man, there's so many tangents we could go on there, but I'm trying to restrain myself. But it is interesting that humanity before Noah
was a vegetarian. They weren't allowed to eat meat. It's very interesting. And that also begs the question, so if they made clothing for themselves, what was it? Was it not of animal hide? Was it some sort of plant clothing, right? Which most of our clothing today is made from plants, cotton, or various things like that. So, but that all goes to say that humanity's original state was actually vegetarian, at least according to the scriptures. It was a vegetarian sort of a state. The book of Revelation, and also the book of Ezekiel prophesies that in the new heavens and the new earth, the lion will lay down with the lamb. And so, it's interesting. Like in the new heavens and the new earth, it appears that we would not be carnivorous. We wouldn't have to eat at all. Really, is the thing. We wouldn't have to eat at all. I think St. Thomas Aquinas at least posits that we could eat for pleasure. Potentially, God could do whatever he wants, and he could create some sort of meat or protein that doesn't actually involve killing an animal, right? He could just create it ex nihilo, right, for the risen, for the humanity after the general resurrection. But it seems clear that there wouldn't be any sort of slaughtering of it. There would be no more death in the new heavens and the new earth. Everything will be as it was meant to be in the Garden of Eden before the fall of man. And that involves no death, which involves no carnivorous eating. And it's also very interesting. Now, the church has been very clear throughout her history that Christians are not bound to be vegetarians. But I don't think one could argue that Christians should not be vegetarians. Just from the scriptural basis alone, but then also from church history, there are numerous religious orders that live, or at least lived at one point, basically vegetarian lives. The Carthusians, for example, they're a reform of the Benedictines. They, to my knowledge, live purely vegetarian lives. They no longer eat meat. Now, that may have changed in the last 100 years or so. They may eat meat on certain feast days, maybe. But I believe in the past, at least, they did not eat meat at all. But that's never been a requirement for the Christian people in general. And the New Testament has made that clear. But it will be a reality, and thus a requirement, in the new heavens and the new earth. So there will not be any sort of slaughtering of animals in the new heavens and the new earth. And it was just an interesting point to think about. And it does, I think, bring, when we look at salvation history in that kind of overarching sort of a way, and we try to look at what is God's design for history, what is his design for creation, we see that death was not in the plan at all. And so, when one takes the life of anything, one should have some sort of awareness of what one's doing. Now, there does come an element of practicality here. If one steps on an ant without realizing it, it's not like that's a sin or anything. We're not jadists or jades, whatever they're called. That the religion in India, where they, the really devout ones will sweep a broom in front of them wherever they go, so they don't step on a bug. They don't kill anything. And I think the reason why that has not been required of us by God is because the proliferation of animals has made it so that it's basically impossible not to kill anything throughout the duration of one's life. It is impossible. You're gonna kill things. That's just an inevitable part of reality. No matter how much you try, you're going to end up killing a bug or a plant or something at some point in your life. So, you have to take in just normal common sense into these things. We can't be restricting people to the absolute ideals, which that's another topic for another time. Why should, particularly governments, why should they not lawfully restrict people to absolute ideals? Why should we not try to create utopia? Well, and actually I have done an episode on utopianism in the past. It's because it's impossible. You can't have utopia. Utopia will not exist on this side of death. And even in heaven, in the sort of interim state, utopia, strictly speaking, will not exist because we will not be united in our bodies. Utopia, truly, in its absolute perfection, will not exist until the new heavens and the new earth. So, yeah. But then how does this circle around and go to the beasts again? How are we tying this back into animals and, let's say, animal rights to whatever extent they do have rights? It would be that anything living, doesn't deserve to die just willy-nilly. You shouldn't go around killing things just because you want to kill them, right? That would be quite perverse. I have a personal story here, and this is to my shame. When I was a teenager, I was at a friend's pond, and we were fishing. And a fish got stuck on our line, and we couldn't get the fish off. So, what did we do? Instead of cutting the line, maybe letting the fish die naturally, or putting the fish out of its misery quickly, we tied it to a firework and blew it up. And it didn't die quickly. And I went to confession for this soon after, particularly really after I had my conversion. I went to confession for this, I confessed this. But even to this day, I think about that instant of needlessly killing that fish. And fish are probably one of the lowest of the animals as regards intellection, right? But they clearly feel pain, and we shouldn't needlessly give them pain. And I needlessly gave that fish pain by strapping it to a firework and letting it slowly die. I don't say this lightly. I'm being serious. Even after all these years, it's been 12 years or so, maybe more. That instance is burned in my skull, and I still feel the sorrow for that sin. I would put that up there as one of the sins that gives me the most pain in my life. Looking back, it gives me the most horror at my own sinfulness and my own wretchedness. Is that moment. So anyway, like I said, I've asked forgiveness for this confession. I've been absolved. I've done the penance for it. And I continue to do penance for whatever temporal punishments I still have not made up for. And I definitely learned from that experience, right? That taught me the gravity of what it means to treat animals with respect. Okay? Even plants. If I go around tromping through a flower bed, not only is that a sin against the person who planted the flower bed with work that they would have put into it, and all of that. It would also be a sin against the flowers themselves, needlessly taking their life and destroying God's creation. So every bit of God's creation deserves the respect of life to a certain extent. Now, there is a necessity of utility there. This doesn't mean that you can't kill anything. This doesn't mean that you can't kill things for the sake of your own sustenance, right? Or else we would die. You have to eat living things in order to live. That's how our bodies work. But there are gradients there. Do I treat plant life to the same extent as I would treat animal life? Well, no. Plant life doesn't have a nervous system. It can't feel pain. So animals, sentient animals, have that next level. They can suffer. And I think, some people, some Christians especially, will try to argue that animals don't actually suffer because they don't have self-awareness, I guess is what they would say. And I would push against that, personally. I think animals do have self-awareness to a certain extent. They aren't rational in the way that humans are rational. But certainly, certain animals will be able to recognize themselves in a mirror, for example. They are definitely getting on each other's nerves back there. I'm almost to my destination, so they will be happy to get there. Certain animals, it would appear, can recognize themselves. They do have some sort of self-awareness. And it's clear that certain animals definitely suffer. Virtually all sentient beings with a nervous system suffer, and they show signs of suffering. So I don't think the Christians that argue that can argue it from very good standards, unless they're trying to say that it's just a brute fact that God designed the animals in such a way that they don't have consciousness, even though it appears that they do. Okay. And I just think that's a bad line of reasoning. We should always take the appearances at what they are before we start making conclusions contrary to the way things appear. Right? Now somebody might push back on that and say, wow. Somebody might push back on that and say, but Parker, it doesn't appear that God is there. Well, that really depends on your viewpoint. I would say it seems clear that it appears by the physical world that God is there, by the fact of entropy, that there is such a thing as motion. I still think Aquinas' argument for motion, these sort of cosmological type of arguments, do have weight. I think that they are quite convincing. If you think about the issue of, I push a rock, something put me into motion, all the way back. You can't have turtles all the way down. That's kind of the phrase. I think it comes from a Hindu like legend or part of their creation story that like the earth is on the back of a turtle and it turtles all the way down. I might be remembering that incorrectly, but people will use that saying like you can't have an infinite regress of motion or of things of any sort. You can't have an infinite regress. And so how do we explain motion? You could maybe argue in a certain sense that there is an eternal motion and it's always moving, right? But then you're back to the same question of God. What the heck is that eternal motion? That's that's pretty close, if not exactly, close to an aspect of classical theism, right? That God is both eternally in motion and also eternally still. He's eternally active and eternally passive, in as much as that paradoxically makes sense. So, So, even if somebody says, but Parker, you can't take appearances at what they are if you're religious, I would push back on that. And I think religious people, theistic people, can take appearances as they are. I think the reality of God transcends the appearances. And I think that in many ways, the appearances of our world point towards a God, or even prove it to whatever extent it can be proven. So yeah, all that to say that it appears that animals feel pain, and so we should we should believe that animals have pain. It appears that many animals have consciousness, and those animals may need to treat as though they have consciousness to the ability that they have it, and they deserve a greater amount of respect for their higher order nature, right? So, I don't know. A consequence of that view would be that it would be more immoral to kill a chimpanzee or a dolphin or a dog, these very high order animals, than it would be to kill a mouse or a frog or a fish, right? And maybe I'm getting my zoology there wrong, but that's beside the point. That you get the point that I'm trying to make. So anyway, I hope that this episode was helpful for you guys. I hope that it was fun kind of talking through these things for me. Maybe you guys won't think it was fun, but this has been, I think, an interesting episode on a very interesting question. And I hold a controversial opinion, I would say, at least in Christian circles. But I think I can defend that position fairly well. So, and I don't think it does anything to contradict Revelation in any sort of a way. So I don't see any reason why I would be amiss in having these opinions about animals. So, alright. Hope that does it. God bless y'all. And let me know what you guys think. If you guys have any ideas for future episodes, feel free to like me on our Facebook page. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That helps us grow more than almost anything else. Also spreading the word of us helps us grow very directly. You can find me on Twitter, PC Catechesis. You can find me on Instagram, Catholicism in the Car. Our website, www.catholicisminthecar.com. So many other things. Find me on Patreon if you want to support, or the Anchor support button, or the GoFundMe page if you want to do a one-time donation. So yeah, all that information is on our website. You can find everything there, catholicisminthecar.com. All right, God bless. Oh, real quick, please feel free to subscribe to any of my podcasts on any of the podcast players. Find me on YouTube. Please subscribe. Like me on Facebook, like the Catholicism Car channel on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We're all there, Catholicism Car. And then I also have a Patreon account if you wish to support what I do at this podcast and this YouTube channel. And you can also support us on Anchor.fm. There's a support button there you click on. I also have links to all this on my website's support page at www.catholicisminthecar.com.